the AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Janine Berg, and I'm a senior economist in the International Labor Organization's Department of Research. Together with my colleague, Pavel Gimrek, we are the curators of this new AI for Good series entitled AI and Work. The AI and Work series seeks to gain insight on how AI is transforming the world of work, but more importantly, what policies are needed to ensure that such transformation is of benefit to the world of work. We are honored to have with us today Professor Daron Acemoglu, Institute Professor at MIT, whose academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, technological change, inequality, labor economics, and economics of networks. He is one of the top-cited economists of our day, with 250,000 citations of his extensive body of work. Professor Acemoglu will be speaking with us on Can We Have Pro-Worker AI? His talk draws from his recently published book with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. For those who haven't read it, and I would encourage everyone to do so, here's a copy of my copy, the book uses historical examples of technological advancement to make the point that the benefits of technology are not automatic, but depend on how the technology is used, and most importantly, whether it serves narrow interests or it is put at the service of the common good. The messages of their book resonate with the values, mandate, and work of the International Labor Organization. Since our founding in 1919, the ILO has sought to ensure that all human beings have the right to pursue their material well-being in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security, and equal opportunity, and that the policies in regard to wages and earnings, working hours, and other conditions of work are calculated to ensure a just share of the fruits of progress to all. The ILO is a tripartite organization with representation of employers and workers' organizations, along with governments. Thus, at its core is the recognition that social dialogue is needed to address the challenges in the world of work and to forge solutions. This is true with respect to technology and how it affects the workplace. Our International Labor Standard, the Termination of Employment Recommendation, calls for using social dialogue to prioritize redeployment and retraining of workers within an organization in case of technological or other sources of unemployment when it's possible. Thus, at its heart, at the ILO is the recognition that forging policies in support of the common good is hard and sometimes messy, that it is the outcome of democratic consultation, and that it requires an understanding of the stakes at hand. The advancements in AI have made this task all the more urgent, given the potential for AI not just to replace some jobs, but also to transform many jobs with consequences for the quality of work and the distribution of income. Professor Acemoglu, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Janine. It's my pleasure to be here. It's a very, very impressive conference, and I'm very happy to share my thoughts on these critical questions. And as you said, I'm going to talk about the topic of the direction of AI. Can we have pro-worker AI? I don't think I need to give a long introduction about the developments in AI. It is clear from the events that have taken place over the last few years that artificial intelligence is going to impact several key aspects of our lives, including how we work, how we communicate, how we politically participate in democratic or non-democratic means. And the amount of resources and energy spent on AI, it's truly astounding. I mean, the sums are getting bigger and bigger. And one very important aspect, which perhaps just bears repeating, is the computational power of these models is so far beyond anything that really humanity had even contemplated until a few years ago. The Gemini Ultra and the latest version of GPT-4 are using, roughly speaking, about 1 trillion times more computational power than the computers that sent people to the moon. So we're really thinking about a huge amount of investment. And the question that I think is critical here that doesn't get asked enough is, what is it that we want from these tools? I'm going to argue that the real promise of generative AI is intelligent, flexible, and easily usable tools that are for humans, complementary to human decision-making, problem-solving, technical work, as well as creative tasks. This is sometimes mentioned or perhaps as a lip service, because it's very different from the way that the current large language models are used and the current way in which these tools are deployed for automation or for revenue generation through digital ads and such channels. And in fact, I'm going to argue that while this promise is real, this is not where we're heading. And in particular, there are major roadblocks that would prevent us getting there, even if there was a general agreement that this promise is the most important thing we should be aiming for. In particular, I'm going to talk about the 4 roadblocks: excessive automation, on which I'm going to spend quite a bit of time because it will enable me to introduce some of the ideas and facts and historical interpretations from my book that Janine very nicely mentioned, Power and Progress, jointly written with Simon Johnson. Then I will talk about informational diversity, human AI misalignment, and monopolized control of information as additional roadblocks. But I think all of these cannot be understood without the business models of the tech companies and the ideology of AI, meaning what are the leading tech entrepreneurs, scientists, and investors in the field of digital technologies and AI thinking about in terms of their priorities, their aspirations. And for those ideologies, before I'll get into the business models, let me talk about the ideologies, because it's the sort of the probably the less familiar element to some of you, would be that we have to go back to the beginnings of the field of computer science, which was spearheaded by this brilliant mathematician, Alan Turing. Many of you know from his various writings or the Hollywood movie, Enigma. But, you know, in addition to being an amazing mathematician who made very, very important breakthroughs, Alan Turing also articulated a set of philosophical ideas in spearheading the future of computer science in some sense. And at the center of those ideas is what you might have heard as the universal Turing machine, a machine that can compute everything that can be computed. And then added to this, the idea that human mind is just a computing machine too. So if you put the two together, then you get that computers, as they advance towards the universal Turing machine, ultimately can do everything that the human mind does. This perspective then led Alan Turing to articulate the idea that autonomous machine intelligence, meaning self-acting, not controlled by humans, machine intelligence, high-level capabilities, are both feasible and desirable ultimately, which immediately leads to a very different perspective about how we should use computers or digital technologies more generally. In particular, if they get better than humans, we should allow them to take more and more tasks away from humans. In other words, automation. And this is what both older style computers and AI have sometimes done. AI itself emerged as a field really in the 1960s, this Dartmouth project, where another bunch of very famous men here are pictured on the lawn of Dartmouth College. They took Alan Turing's idea of what computers are about very much to heart, and they articulated the project of artificial intelligence on this, and they were even more optimistic than Alan Turing, many of them predicting that within less than a year, there would be things that today we would identify with artificial general intelligence. This, however, is not the only vision or the only ideology of computer science and artificial intelligence. In fact, from the very beginning, at the same time as Alan Turing was writing, several other important people were also grappling with the same issues. Most important, perhaps, is this MIT former colleague of mine. Well, we never overlapped, but Norbert Wiener, who was a very important mathematician and engineer. As early as 1949, Wiener was worrying about what automation would mean for human identity and human work, and he articulated the idea, which Simon and I call in the book machine usefulness, to contrast with machine intelligence, that machines are best as useful tools for humans, and that really requires better communication, better co-work between digital tools and human decision makers. These ideas, perhaps building on Wiener or not, it's a little bit hard to say, were later picked up by others. Douglas Engelbart, who was a very important engineer, is particularly useful to mention here because he articulated a very powerful version of this in terms of human-machine complementarities, but also he spearheaded a number of innovations based on this. So in fact, I would say many of the things that we depend on today, computer mouse, hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers, all came out of this view that computers should be complementary to human decision-making. And J.C.R. Licklider similarly articulated these ideas, what he called human-machine symbiosis, but also was the sort of driving force of his design of the ARPANET and then internet protocols, which of course is a brilliant example of human-machine complementarity. Internet is nothing other than algorithms giving humans access to other human knowledge. But in some sense, when J.C.R. Licklider was writing more than 60 years ago of human-machine or man-computer symbiosis, the things that he was saying, which I think are very inspiring, when he says human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way approached by the information handling machines we know today. So this was a very inspiring vision of machines in the service of humans. But actually, it wasn't quite feasible 60 years ago. The advances in computer science were quite impressive, but they weren't up to the task. The reason why I think AI is exciting and has the real promise that I just mentioned is because it actually makes the Licklider sort of aspiration much closer to reality. And I think it's very important to sort of step back and note that this is true not just for people like us, academics or thinkers or office workers, but it's actually true for all sorts of manual occupations or other things that involve interaction with the real world. Because much of what we do today is a series of problem solving. If you take an electrician, what an electrician does is deal with problems that he may not have encountered before. And the irony of our current age, going back again to Licklider and the internet, is that information is abundant. Everything you want to know and a lot of things you don't want to know are on the internet, but useful information is scarce. So if you're an electrician trying to deal with a specific problem, the useful information for you is what the problem you're encountering is, how you can troubleshoot it, what new equipment you need to get, or what other adjustments you need to make. That useful information is very difficult to find in real time unless you are a very, 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 very expert electrician. So the real promise of generative AI is to actually make that sort of useful information available. So generative AI is an informational tool. It can filter, it can curate, it can quickly retrieve and present information to human problem solvers so that human problem solvers get much better. And this is true for not just electricians, it's true for healthcare workers, educators, journalists, plumbers, blue-collar workers, and so on. Is this just a pie in the sky? Well, yes. In some sense, it is pie in the sky. In some sense, it is optimistic because that's not necessarily the direction, as I'm going to argue, where the current investment in AI is going. But there are some proof of concept studies that show it can actually be achieved. So in a number of different settings, for example, in context of very simple HTML programming with GitHub Copilot by Peng et al., Noe and Jacques in the context of summarizing text, Brynjolfsson et al. In the context of customer service, randomized control trial methods show that generative AI can actually play a little bit of this role. And you can see it can play a little bit of that role from, for example, the Noe and Zhang paper, for which I am summarizing here with this graph here. The gray is the control group, linked, plotted according to how good they were in their task before the experiment. And green is the treatment group that gets access to the generative AI tool. And what you see is that the generative AI is really helping workers who don't have very high level expertise. It's not helping the top 20, 30% of the writers. They are much better than generative AI can be at this point. But even though they are not like the super skilled workers in this experiment, but the remaining 70% actually can improve their expertise by the information provision or the help of generative AI. So this sort of potential of help from generative AI for human workers themselves becoming more productive is possible. But the roadblocks, I think, are even more formidable. And let me now try to explain what those roadblocks are. And I think excessive automation is emblematic because it highlights both how we have misused other digital technologies and how this misuse is likely to spread to AI, and how this misuse is embedded in both the business models of tech companies and the ideology of AI, emphasizing autonomous machine intelligence rather than usefulness of machines to humans. But as Exhibit A, I want to show you what has happened to inequality, especially in the US, but the picture is not that different in other industrialized nations, although not as extreme, during the digital age. Before the digital age, in the decades that followed World War II, you had a period that could be characterized quite fairly as shared prosperity. You can capture that in this picture, or you can see that in this picture, by the evolution of the real, meaning inflation-adjusted wages of 10 demographic groups distinguished by men and women, gender, and education, all the way from workers without a high school degree in the US labor market in orange, high school degree in green, associate degree, just a college degree, and postgraduate degree. And you see these curves are on top of each other in the years following 1963, and the pattern is similar, even more favoring of the low-skilled workers before the 1963 from other data sources. So during this period, all of these groups are growing in tandem. They're all enjoying rapid real wage increases. And in fact, the real wage increases are really impressive. They're at the same rate as productivity growth. During this period, productivity growth is fast. And they are about 2.5 percentage points every year in real terms, which would mean that in about 30 years, your real income would double if you can hold a job like this. This was the era of shared prosperity. Unfortunately, it didn't last. And you can see the break sometime around 1980s, where these curves are starting to fan out, but even more jarringly, low education groups are experiencing real income losses rather than gains. So productivity is increasing, but only the most educated groups are benefiting from it. The low education groups are not benefiting, or perhaps even are losing out. Well, this sea change in US labor markets, which again has some parallel in other labor markets, not perfect, has many causes, but my work argues that automation, how we have used digital technologies just for excessive automation, is one of its drivers. And to make that point, let me explain one more figure, which is from my work with Pascual Restrepo in here. So what I'm doing here is I'm shifting the focus from the 10 demographic groups to more detailed demographic groups, now distinguished by gender, education, age, and ethnicity. The color coding here shows you the education level of the demographic groups. The size of the circle is the size of the demographic group. And then I'm shifting the focus, rather than the time series evolution of real wages, to the change in real wages, the cumulative change in real wages from 1980, that critical period of inequality increase, to just before the COVID crisis, 2016, 2017. And you can see some demographic groups were experiencing almost a doubling of their real incomes, 60, 70, 80% increases in real incomes. But the majority, or about half, not the majority, sorry, I'm sorry, it's not the majority, it's just under half of the demographic groups are actually below the zero line here, meaning that they are not experiencing any gains. Many of them are experiencing losses. And more interestingly, you can see on the horizontal axis, you have my and Pascual Restrepo's measure of automation, what fraction of tasks that were performed by your demographic group in 1980 that have since been automated. And if you take that number, you see there's a very strong correlation between that and the real wage increases. And in particular, almost all of the demographic groups that have experienced real wage declines since 1980 are those that have been subject to a lot of automation. And the problem is that this automation, we argue and provide other evidence to show, is excessive. Much of it didn't bring huge benefits, but led to really this explosion of inequality. This is not a new phenomenon. You see the same things in other episodes, most notably during the Industrial Revolution. The reason why Simon and I wrote Power and Progress is in part to provide a historical and conceptual framework to think about AI and digital technologies, and in the process also correct some misconceptions, like when you get from many tech leaders saying, well, look, things have worked out so well in the past, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, why are you afraid of AI? Well, things haven't worked so well in the past. The first 90 years or so of the Industrial Revolution were a terrible time for working people. Real wages were stagnant, even declining for most in the most dynamic sectors such as textiles. Working hours increased by 20%. Working conditions got much worse. And a lot of that is about power, who hold power in factories, and also the nature of technological progress. In particular, the same type of thing that we're seeing with the digital technologies and excessive focus on automation, which led to a de-skilling process and the decline in wages, which were profitable but not good for the workers and not amazingly good for productivity either. Now, today, when people say the Industrial Revolution was better, they're thinking of the second phase or they're bunching or confusing the first and the second phase, where real wages started growing. But notably, that wasn't an automatic process. There was nothing preordained about that, and it took an amazingly radical set of institutional changes. Britain became a democracy from being a very aristocratic oligarchic regime where less than 2% of the population had the vote, to essentially universal mail and then universal suffrage by the last quarter of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. Trade unions, which were very heavily prosecuted, became legal in the last quarter of the 19th century. And there was a significant redirection of technology away from textile mills that just de-skilled work, but actually new machinery that introduced skilled work. Now, AI is a different technology. It could be used in many different ways. But work that I have done, for example, with David Otter, Pascual Restrepo, and Joe Hazel shows that the early AI, for example, the big explosion AI investment in around 2017 or so, was very much targeted at automation. It was the establishments that had automatable tasks that invested in AI. And when they did that, they reduced their investments. And again, the productivity gains weren't amazing. So for everybody who is so optimistic about AI's productivity gains, I think AI's effects on inequality as well as productivity are going to be very contingent. They're going to depend on how you use them. Better AI is possible. And it's, again, something we can get some clues about from history. So this is Henry Ford's factory. Henry Ford was not an altruist. He was not a friend of labor. He was not a friend of unions. But actually what he did in his factories was much better than the way we're using digital technologies today. Even though he was a leader in electrification and mechanization of the production process, he also introduced a range of new tasks for workers. So you see, as the new machinery with the decentralized electricity source was introduced in an interchangeable or assembly line fashion, you also have workers that are performing tasks that weren't existing before. And this is actually backed up by a whole amount of engineering, white-collar clerical work, maintenance, repair, and quality control. And it was this that led to an explosion in employment in the auto industry as the sector was being transformed, rather than the kinds of disemployment effects, displacement effects that we have seen with digital technologies in the past. So new tasks for workers that is based on better information, better technology, better upskilling of work is very critical. And I think there are many ways in which you can use AI and digital technologies today, and the generative AI advances are going to help with that if we use them the right way. But AI is nothing but an informational tool, and I think the promise actually lies in this informational tool, as I have explained, that we can try to provide better information, better useful information to human problem solvers. But the issue is that every informational tool, even simpler ones than AI, create a lot of tensions. And one of the big tensions that can actually destroy the benefit of informational tool is that it leads to, what happened? It leads to a loss of informational diversity among humans. You can see that, for example, with a much better, and I would say so far much better proven technology than AI, GPS, which is, an amazingly useful and versatile technology. But when GPS is first introduced, for example, into navigation systems, and this is actually predicted by theory and evidence backs it up, what you see is that it doesn't lead to an amazing improvement in traffic congestions, and it leads to worse traffic conditions, for example, in London, in the minor roads. Why is that? Because these AI tools, especially the early versions, sent everybody down to the same shortcuts, but these shortcuts became bottlenecks, and they really started slowing traffic down throughout city streets. So I think the same problem is going to be a threat when it comes to generative AI, which claims to be a much more widely applicable and authoritative source of information. And I think one hope of the AI enthusiasts is that it doesn't matter. Even if it leads to informational diversity loss among humans, AI can make up for it. The evidence actually is not so favorable to that. And in particular, you can even see already a pattern of AI digging its own grave emerging. So I mentioned GitHub Copilot in one of the experimental studies that Peng et al. Used. Well, GitHub Copilot, how is it that it actually knows how to program? Is it so smart that it has understood the full rules of programming, so it's deriving subroutine construction from first principles? No, it doesn't do it that way. It just does it the same sort of copying way. It finds subroutines that humans have written, and then it modifies them as it predicts the human instructions might actually require in very simple ways. And then the question is, where did it get this information? Well, it turns out there's a wonderful place for it. It's the main source of programming expertise in the ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot, which is Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a wonderful website where you can you have a math version and you have a computer science version, and you can go there with your own problems and post questions, and experts spend their time, their mental power to come up with solutions, and those solutions are then upvoted, downvoted, shared by other people, and become part of collective knowledge. So, of course, without asking any permissions from anybody, all of these large language models were trained on Stack Overflow. But then in this pattern of what I've called AI digging its own grave, what you see, let me just focus on this picture here, is that the moment ChatGPT becomes available so people can use it for getting the same information as Stack Overflow, traffic in Stack Overflow completely collapses. There's no longer the same type of human information generation in Stack Overflow. And this is really related to ChatGPT because you don't see the same thing in Math Overflow, where there is no math expertise in ChatGPT, and you don't see it in the Russian and Chinese versions of this website where ChatGPT was banned. So the problem is, of course, the next type of advanced programming that you may want to learn, you're not going to be able to do it because this website has now been destroyed. Now, the problem I would actually say is much more severe because the loss of informational diversity is the tip of an iceberg where you really need the right type of coordination and collaboration and communication between human decision makers and AI. And the problem is that the black box nature of large language models and their lack of reliable information, hallucination, and all sorts of other problems really make it much harder to have that sort of alignment. In particular, evidence from existing studies that look at predictive policing and medical doctor radiologist behavior show that there is, in general, a complete breakdown of communication and miscalibration of information. So, for example, this very interesting paper by my colleagues, Agrawal, Saltz, and co-authors, shows that physicians misinterpret the information from an AI-based model. They put more weight on information that AI recommends that they themselves have already, so creating confirmation bias, but they systematically underweight other information. And as a result, they actually start making worse decisions rather than better decisions. And this is an endemic problem. You're not going to be able to solve it unless AI models change their architecture completely and become much less black box. The final point I want to make is, the final roadblock I want to point out is that every informational tool, in fact, every technology, but particularly every informational tool, is also about control. This is what Jeremy Bentham perhaps implicitly understood but never admitted, that his wonderful panopticon contraption was really a method of controlling people. And it wasn't just an efficiency enhancement, but it's about who's going to control who. And we already have a very bad track record in terms of this, because when control of information becomes monopolized, it becomes a tool for supporting authoritarianism against democracy, and it becomes a tool for manipulation, as we have seen with social media. The issue is that generative AI is going to have potentially greater powers of manipulation, and it's going to create much more the possibility of individual specific manipulative actions. And I think the danger here is not just to the use of generative AI as a production tool, but or at a societal level. And it's something that Hannah Arendt foresaw more than 50 years ago when she wrote in the New York Review of Books, if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. But if that happens, which I think there is a danger that it might with the incorrect development of generative AI, then you're going to have a real hard time with democracy, which really depends on shared understanding, shared knowledge. Now, we can do generative AI better, and that's what I was trying to argue at the very beginning, but either it's going to be the market process that takes us there. Well, I have argued due to the business model of the large tech companies, which relies on automation and manipulation through digital ads revenue, for example, we are unlikely to get there. We might get there because of science. Well, that's also unlikely to happen, because if you look at science, it's been completely taken over by the large tech companies. So here is, for example, what's going on in AI system research. In the early 2000s, almost all of it was academic, and academic had very little money from big tech companies. Today, just about 10% is academic, but even that gets a lot of funding from big tech, and industry is doing a lot of it, and academic industry collaboration is about 25% of it. So it's very difficult for autonomous science to do something that's not completely aligned with the agenda of the large tech companies. But if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, how we did it was, how things changed was through an institutional reform. It wasn't just science. It wasn't just the market process, but an institutional reform. And so I think we need fundamental institutional changes, fundamental policy changes, and fundamental involvement of civil society and democratic citizenry, so that we have democratic control over the future of AI, and we can push and steer AI in a much more socially beneficial direction, which is this machine usefulness idea, rather than the one that is become such an obsession in the industry, artificial general intelligence or machine intelligence at the expense of humans. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and comments.
Professor Acemoglu, thank you so much for this. And it's, of course, one type of privilege to read your books and papers, and another one to be able to actually ask you questions about things that we have been thinking about and we are often asked about. And so thank you very much for this opportunity. And my first question is around the notion of productivity. So you mentioned a range of those recent experimental studies that essentially observe that people using some of these AI tools can be more productive in very particular settings, and that it has this redistributive effect on skills. So it might be able to give access to people, to more people, to what was previously limited, more technical knowledge. And then we have seen a number of these global studies that made some sort of big promises about potential predictions of the impact of these technologies on productivity. And then in April this year, you published a paper that I read as sort of pouring a bucket of cold water on many of these predictions. You not only lay out beautiful maths in there and in a very didactical way explain how to think about production function and productivity impact, but you also come up with these calculations of not more than 0.7% increase in total factor productivity over 10 years in the US. And when you correct that for difficult tasks, then that turns out to even be a positive, still an optimistic scenario. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about this study, the framework that you used, how you come to these calculations, and especially this notion of bad tasks, which I found quite fascinating in the paper.
Well, thank you very much, Pavel. There's a lot to discuss, and thank you for your very kind comments. Let me actually, we can come back to the bad tasks perhaps later. Let me focus on the framework and the numbers, because I think they are important to explain, and thanks for bringing it up. So actually, I don't dispute in that paper the numbers that I refer to as well from the experimental studies, such as the one by Eric Brynjolfsson in the customer service, or in the summarizing task. So I take those as the productivity gains. But what I just note is that essentially the implicit assumption, or sometimes the explicit assumption, of both some commentators and the tech industry is that those productivity gains are going to apply to a very large number of tasks in the economy. And that seems very unrealistic. So at the moment, the AI models have very little they can contribute to any task that involves a interaction with the real world. So the electrician example, educator example that I gave, those are right now not really impacted by the existing generative AI models. So since the adoption of technology in general is very slow, we cannot be very optimistic that a new model of AI is going to come and is going to be immediately adopted by electricians, by blue-collar workers, by delivery workers, and so on and so forth. So if that's the case, then the productivity gains are really going to come from things that can immediately be done in a cost-effective way by AI. So in particular, again, for the US economy, in a comprehensive survey that we did with the Census Bureau in 2019, only 1.5% of US businesses had invested in AI. Today, it's a little bit higher, I presume. We haven't seen the new version of that survey yet. But you can see it's not going to be very quick for most US workers to start using AI or to be replaced by AI. So on the basis of this, I estimate that perhaps about 20% of current US tasks can be ultimately performed by the current AI technology and software building on it, computer vision technology building on it. But only about a quarter of that, less than 5%, is going to be cost-effective and feasible within 10 years. So when you take that and combine that with the productivity gains in terms of labor income cost reductions from the studies, then you end up with the number that I gave you 0.7%. And that doesn't even take into account that some of these tasks are actually much harder to learn by external observations, and that's the one that that is the further correction that reduces it to about 0.5% within 10 years, which is, not bad. I will take 0.5% more money within 10 years, but it's not a revolutionary change. And then you can worry about the bad tasks. I think that's related to, let me not go on too much more on that, but that's related to this manipulation. So if you make money from AI in manipulative ways by, say, fooling people or pushing them into schemes or getting them to buy things that they don't want, that might show up as, oh, well, you're making a lot of money using AI, but it's not going to contribute to welfare.
Well, I can only recommend reading the paper to our audience.
It's
titled "The Simple Microeconomics of AI." It is anything but simple, but it's a great read. And I wanted to come back to what is essentially the title of your book, and it appears in your previous book, which is the notion of power. And basically, you already mentioned that the impact on economies and on societies is largely about decisions taken around it and the power to take those decisions, or the sharing of power in negotiations around taking those decisions. And of course, one of the key instruments to rebalancing power relations are institutions and regulations. And what I am reading also from you is that we're seeing quite a big imbalance of power emerging, with even some of the states falling behind in terms of technological capacity, expertise on AI, access to data. Labor is more dispersed in the digital economy than it was during the previous transformation phases. So I wanted to ask about your thoughts on institutions and regulations in that context and your recommendations. Whether you think that the current institutions can and should be improved, or do you think we need new regulations, new institutions? And also, coming from the ILO, I'm very curious about your thoughts at the international level, because your book is very much US focused, but of course we think about it also in terms of international institutions and norms.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Actually, I think there are three aspects to your questions that are all very, very important. So let me answer the first one as I understand it, and then I will split the next two questions out of that first one. So yes, you are 100% right in your understanding that we need institutional and regulatory solutions to the control of AI and how AI is developed. And no, our current regulations and institutions are not up for it. But I would say that in the past, when we've had successful episodes, some of them very slow, but when we had successful episodes of institutional change in the context of dealing with the market processes, inequality, and the broader unequalizing effects of technology, there were even bigger institutional changes. So the British Industrial Revolution, I gave the example of how that change happened. You started from a situation in which the country was completely non-democratic, and all type of worker organization was very heavily prosecuted. So it was a real sea change in that context. So if you look at the progressive era in the United States, where the first systematic legislation and policies against monopoly were passed, the democratic fabric of US was much weaker, senators being in the pockets of the big trusts and not even directly elected, no income tax, no regulations that could be used. And again, once the political winds changed, there were major institutional reforms. So yes, our institutions are not ready for it, but I do see the possibility that we could actually move in that direction. And some of the emphasis that's changing in the US, in Europe, about the power of tech and what we want from tech, I think could be contributing factors. But in achieving this, I think a very important element, and this is the next two parts of your question, is actually having a broad participation. And that broad participation in deciding what we want from AI and what the direction of AI should be is not just a fairness question. It's also an efficiency question. And I think there are two groups of stakeholders here that are particularly important to have and are completely missing. One is workers, the other one is the broader developing world. Workers, I think, is critical. So let me argue why. If you even only partially believe what I said, which is that part of, I said the whole, but believe it only part of the promise of AI is to make workers more productive, it is impossible to do that without having worker voice. So today, even despite all of the distortions of the international aid industry, if you came up to UN or ILO and said, I'm going to solve the problem of poverty in Malawi, but I have no intention of going to Malawi or to Africa. I'm going to do that sitting in my office in Geneva. I don't think that would have great credibility. So in the same way, I think it should have no credibility to say that I'm going to make workers become much more productive, but I want no input from the workers. Just crazy. Workers are the ones who know what the challenges that they face. They have all the tacit knowledge. They have all the understanding of the production process and the difficulties that they encounter on the ground. So worker voice is not just important for fairness reasons, it's also important for actually making these technologies work. But I think it would be even bigger sacrilege than the other things that I said to the tech industry that they should actually have workers give them advice. So I think there is something completely wrong there. Second, there are about 6 billion people who live outside of the US, China, European Union, Canada, who are going to be massively affected by AI. And they have zero voice in what AI will do and how it will be used. So AI is something done to them without their agency. You see that already with surveillance technologies, which are developed in China and exported to more than 60 countries, that reduces democratic rights of citizens around the world. And I think there is a real danger that the next phase of AI is going to be just like that, out of the control of this 6 billion people imposed on them. And I think the only chance is politicians in these parts of the world wake up and start worrying about this, and international organizations actually play the role of intermediating and the knowledge flow between these 6 billion people and the rest, and especially the tech industry.
Maybe continuing on the 6 billion people, actually in your book, you list a range of incentives for complementarity of technology, of AI and labor that you talked about earlier. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more about those different incentives that go far beyond tax incentives. You list a range of possible actions, and also further your take on the impact on developing countries. That's partially self-motivated. We are finishing a paper with the World Bank where we try to calculate how many people in Latin America region might not be able to benefit from the transformation because they don't have access to the tools like internet and a computer at work. And we have calculations that show it's maybe about half. So I'm wondering, what is your take on developing economies and impact? Are they more protected behind the buffer of lower wages, lower labor costs, digital divide, or is it more that they are likely to miss out on those productivity benefits? So it's a bit of a false protection.
Wonderful question.
How do you think about
well, first of all, please send me the paper when you have it. Sounds fascinating. I would love to see those numbers. But second, even if you were a completely unconstrained and benevolent policymaker in a developing country, the problem is very hard. The problem is very hard, first of all, because in the US or in Europe, the challenge is how can we make AI be more socially beneficial, more pro-worker, more pro-democracy, and then we have a belief that most people would have access to it. There is enough innovation, there is enough investment so that it would spread and people would use it. If you are in a developing world, you have the triple challenge that many businesses are going to be behind the curve in terms of using AI, even if it were available. Two, many workers are going to either not have access to the internet or to a basic computing infrastructure to be able to use it, and may not even have the basic computer literacy to use even a relatively flexible tool. And then the third is that, in fact, while this is all happening within your economy, and you might think exactly like you said, Powell, that there is a little bit more time for adjustment because worker wages are lower, so this will reduce the speed with which automation would happen. Well, international division of labor will be changing. So, and if the international division of labor changes, then that's completely out of the control of the economy. So, for example, in India, about 10% of the formal labor force is now working in some sort of offshoring service tasks. So, service tasks that are offshore to India. Well, within 10 years, a significant fraction of these tasks may be automated or may be done in a reshored manner with the help of large language models in the US or Europe. So the international division of labor can create major displacement effects in the developing world. And that is why it's so critical to consider the implications for the developing world. I think the general perspective, the general situation is bad news here for the developing world. There is only one good news. And that good news is that if you actually manage to redirect AI in a more pro-worker direction in the US, I think that will also help the developing world. Why? Because in a pro-worker direction, it means that you can actually help blue-collar workers, plumbers, electricians, healthcare workers in the United States. Well, the same infrastructure would help those workers in the developing world. And in fact, the potential gains there could be much greater because, electricians are great in the developing world in terms of many manual skills, but they are even further behind in terms of dealing with sophisticated equipment, or they will be behind in terms of dealing with the electricity grid, for example. So the expertise that they get from the right AI tools could be quite important in the developing world.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience, actually quite a few, and they're a bit all over the place. So let me just start with some of the more concrete ones, and maybe also I'll throw in a few of my questions.
Thank you, Jenny.
One of them is about if you could explain your proposal more about how the government could subsidize or support the development of complementary AI.
Yeah, I don't have a silver bullet there. Because it's a difficult problem. My only claim is that that needs to be done, and we have to find a way of doing it, and it's not impossible. And I draw a parallel to what was done in a rather haphazard way with the renewables in the energy transformation. So over the last 15 years, with a modicum of support in terms of innovation subsidies in the US and Europe, some carbon taxes in Europe, and subsidies for solar panel producers in China, there was a complete change in the production capacity and technological level in the renewables that used to be about 10 times as expensive as fossil fuels, and now they are cheaper than fossil fuels in electricity generation. So how was that achieved? Well, we first had some measurement framework, meaning we knew what we were targeting. We were targeting low carbon technologies, and those were identified. Not everything that was identified was feasible. Many people spent money and time on carbon capture, which doesn't seem that feasible or such a great idea at the moment. But you do some experimentation. And I think the same thing should be applied to AI. We don't want to prevent automation. I'm not against automation. We have to automate things. The future will have automation. The past has automation, and we definitely don't want to go back to the days where it was, shovels and human muscle for instead of excavators and cranes. So nothing wrong with automation. So if some of the innovation subsidies that come from the government go to automation, nothing wrong with that. But I think the important thing is for expert advice to be used for identifying underinvestment areas for AI that could be complementary to humans. And I can come up with my list of, I can come up with at least 10 broad technological areas in education, in healthcare, in blue-collar work, in different types of virtual reality interfaces Not all of them may be viable, but we start from there, and then we'll see, and we experiment in the same way that we experimented with the energy sector. There'll be some type 1 and type 2 errors, but I think that's going to be very important to do.
Okay, great. Then there was somebody who made a comment about how they work in the field of robotics and how there's very important advances in robotics in the next several years, and that this is something to keep in mind. And it ties in with something that someone else wrote about. They wanted your opinion on dark factories and their future and the considerations for automation. So from a policy perspective, what is your sense on dark factories?
Well, so first of all, the comment that I haven't seen, but your report is absolutely right. I think a very important frontier is going to be integrating AI, computer vision, and other types of information processing from sensors and other types of environmental local environment into robots. And that could really ultimately revolutionize robotics technology. I don't think those kinds of robots are going to be in factories within the next few years. I think it's a very slow process from what I've seen. And even when you see demos, those demos are not always realistic or close to being implemented. But ultimately, we're going to get there. And when we get there, that's going to be one more step closer to workerless factories, and also one more step closer to dark factories. Those have been the inspiration for some managers, by the way. As early as 1951, some American business magazines were saying the workerless factories are around the corner and managers are excited. Well, if I were a manager, I think I wouldn't be so excited. Meaning that, yes, of course, cutting costs is great, but it's not the only way, and I don't think it's the most successful way of creating a thriving business. I think many thriving businesses are made special by their most important resource, their workers. So I think as a manager, we can also aspire to having a factory or a workplace where it's not that we get rid of the workers, but we make the existing workers more productive. And that's what I was articulating. So even with AI combined robots, I think there are going to be many tasks that humans can do better because of social skills, because of judgment, because of wisdom, because of tacit knowledge. And I think it will be the managers and the companies that can really use those tools that should be more successful in the long run.
Right. And this actually kind of brings me to another point about the use of technology and the use of AI and how it's integrated into the workplace. So you can make a distinction between, let's say, bottom-up uses, so the worker deciding to use ChatGPT to improve their skills, or an AI affecting the let's say a call center and how the calls are routed and taking that autonomy away from the worker and actually resulting in not only a poor work environment for the worker, fewer staff, but also less customer service.
Right.
So those are the things that we struggle with, but they're hard to tackle from a policy perspective. And
they are absolutely hard to tackle, and that's why I emphasize, what the managers and the business leaders should do. So again, if you are running a customer service company, the path of least resistance may appear like get rid of all of the customer service agents, replace them with AI, and then keep a few ones who will deal with the most complex cases that cannot be dealt with. So what you're doing there is, you're shifting some of the cost to the customer. Mm-hmm. And the customers are aware of that. They're not stupid. They know that instead of talking to a customer service agent for 1 minute, they have to spend 10 minutes trying to explain their problem to AI via menus and via ill-fitting conversation. Second, you are missing all sorts of opportunities where a human can provide better help. And third, you are also putting humans in a very difficult place. Why? Because humans are only brought in when the problem has reached such a alarmingly bad situation where the customer is very dissatisfied and frustrated and everything has gone wrong until now. So the alternative of keeping the humans in the loop and using AI for example, providing background information, providing a usable real-time menu of how you can help the human customer via a human customer service agent that can build empathy, social communication, and use expertise. I think that's a much better path. But again, we'll see. Will business managers have that wisdom? Whether capital markets will allow them to do that, and whether the tech companies will provide the tools for that rather than just for tools for automation. And that's where the excessive automation issue comes in.
Right, right. Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much. So we are going to be wrapping up now, and unless there's any other more questions that I see here. Well, there's one more here about a little bit about democracy, which I think is important to talk about, also because of workplace democracy and the role really that has in designing technology. So here's a question about the relationship between the value of human labor and the future of democracies. With the comparative cost of human labor becoming increasingly expensive in contrast to automized labor, we might assume that we will need substantially less human labor. Once human labor is not needed in the current dimensions anymore, what will constitute the value of human beings, and how will this affect democracies?
Well, I think there are many, many issues raised here. And again, my perspective is that that's not an inevitable path. Indeed, if you think either that it is already cast in stone, AI is going to be used for automation, or that in the very near future, we're moving to something like AGI, supercomputers, and supercomputer supported super robots, you might think, well, humans are redundant. And if that's the case, I think that's a very, very sad world. I think that's a world in which humans have lost their meaning. But I think, A, I don't view that as likely or feasible. But B, if that's not feasible, I think the alternative of creating more sophisticated tasks and having humans contribute to productivity is still an available path. We have done it in the past, we can do it now, and that's why I emphasize this machine usefulness. So I think we can have future factories and future workplaces where humans work alongside digital tools, and they can be empowered further by these digital tools. And I think that's the same thing is also true for national democracy or polity-level democracy. There's nothing, absolutely nothing inevitable about AI manipulating people, AI being used as a surveillance tool to kill all sorts of civil society action. AI is quite capable of being used as a pro-democracy tool for building new platforms, for building better ways of communicating, for building better participation pathways for citizenry. And actually, again, it's not just pie in the sky. We've seen this happen, for example, over the last 6 years in Taiwan, where there are many AI-supported platforms that have made Taiwanese democracy work better and work better than many others in the West at the moment.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to have you. Thank you for your books. Please keep writing and informing us. And
thank you, Janine. Thank you, Pavel. It was fantastic questions, and it was a true pleasure to be joining the AI for Good Summit and to be sharing the stage with you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Pavel.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
you.